Ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome a great patriot, a great Democrat, and a great campaigner, Mr. John Mills.
Well, these are turbulent times we're in, and what I'd like to do this afternoon is to give you some thoughts about what's likely to happen and what's not likely to happen, and where I think we, with a bit of luck, will finish up. Now, really, we've got three choices. Essentially, we stay in, we accept the withdrawal agreement, or we have no deal. In the end of the day, those are the choices that we're going to have to make. But to get to remain, we are going to have a referendum, because that is the only way that that Parliament will get this sort of democratic cover to allow that to go through. Now, that's not what I want to see happen, but what I would like to say to you is that I think it's really very unlikely that Parliament in the end is going to agree to a second referendum, which then brings us back to the choices which I think we've really got to face. Now, why aren't we going to have a second referendum? I'll tell you why. First of all, you need government time to get the legislation through. And the government doesn't want to have a second referendum for reasons which I will come to very shortly. But even if they did agree to have a second referendum and to provide the parliamentary time, you'd still have to have primary legislation to get this through, which would open up all the difficulties there are about getting the arrangements for the referendum in place, and all the difficulties which would have to be confronted to get that to happen. Now, this would then involve inevitably a long delay and uncertainty. There have been various estimates, as you may have seen, about how long it would take to get a referendum organised. The government thought it would take up to a year. I think actually there's a reasonable chance that you'd get it through more quickly, maybe in 6 months, but you would still have a very long period of time when there was uncertainty about what was going to happen, and the prolonging all the difficulties of deciding where we're going to go ahead. But to do this, you then have to get Article 50 suspended. Now, we can revoke Article 50 and decide to stay in the European Union if we can get that through Parliament, without having the agreement of the other 27 states in Europe and the European Parliament. Extending Article 50, as I'm sure you know, requires their agreement. And that is going to be necessarily impossible to achieve, but likely to be difficult. And knowing the European Union will almost certainly be tied up with conditions which you don't want. I don't know whether you know how much the last referendum cost. £139 million. And Brenda from Bristol doesn't want another referendum. So that's not another factor that don't need to take into account. Another referendum would be incredibly divisive. The first one was pretty divisive, another one would be even more so. And this is a particular problem for Labour MPs. If you look at the seats which Labour is going to have to try to win to become a majority party, 35 out of the top of the 45 required have got substantial Leave majorities. And if you look at the seats which Labour is most likely to lose, 16 out of 20 again have got Leave majorities. And this is one of the reasons why it's going to be so difficult for the proponents of a second referendum to get the deal through Parliament. I hardly need to persuade you that having a second referendum would be extremely undemocratic. You will recall all the promises that were given by all sorts of people about what the outcome of the referendum would be in terms of it being respected. We had £9 million spent on a leaflet that went round just before the referendum period started, assuring you that the government would respect the result. You had endless assurances in the House of Commons. You had 80% or so of MPs, or Labour and Conservative ones, all elected on manifestos in 2017 that they were going to implement the result of the referendum. And to reverse that now with a second referendum, maybe, I don't know how many referendums you're going to have. Oh, by the way, it would be a third referendum for me, because I was the national agent in 1975 for the National Referendum Campaign. So I know a thing or two about referendums. It was also far from clear. I mean, the people who want a second referendum, they want it because they think the result would be a Remain decision. But I'm not at all sure that would be the result. I think if you just concentrate on what the feeling is inside the M25, where all my experience is you go to most meetings, not I have to say this one, where you've got a large majority of people who are in favour of Remain. As soon as you get outside the M25, it's all completely different. And I think if you look at the whole country, you may very well find the result would be the same as it was last time round. But perhaps the most difficult issue of all is what would the question be if you had a second referendum? And this brings me on to the main thing which I want to say to you today. There's been quite a lot of discussion in the contributions about what would happen if there was no deal. And I think one of the most deplorable things that we're experiencing at the moment is people describing what might happen as chaotic, impossible, disastrous, all this sort of thing, with no serious consideration about how difficult it would actually be. And if you do look at the various issues that are raised by no deal, you know, whether we run short of food, whether we're going to run short of medicine, whether there's going to be lorries all backed up all over the place in Kent, actually the more you drill down into all this, the less problematic it looks to me. Now, I'm not one of the people who believes that if you had a no deal, there would be no problems. I think there probably would be some pretty serious problems, but I think we'd get through them. And I think the cost of doing this might be quite considerable, but it wouldn't be enormous. But what I would say to you is this: just consider what you would gain by going for a no-deal outcome. And there are four absolutely crucial bits of this which you need to bear in mind. The first is that if we sign the withdrawal agreement, we're then committed by international treaty to paying £39 billion, irrespective of what comes out of the subsequent negotiations. We will have thrown away all the leverage that the payment of that money might secure. Now, I'm not one of the people who said we shouldn't pay them anything. I think we are under a legal obligation to pay at least some of this, maybe half. But to agree in advance to pay £39 billion without any idea what we're going to get in return seems to me to be absolutely, well, ridiculous, but also to throw away one of the strongest cards that we've got. So if we did have no deal, at least we would have £39 billion worth of negotiating power in our pockets for the next stage. The second thing about that is that we would call the bluff on Northern Ireland. The EU have said they don't want a hard border. The Irish have said they don't want a hard border. We have said we don't want a hard border. If there's no deal, who is going to put a hard border in place? And I think what would happen is you would force the EU back to where they've actually already indicated they're going to be, where they're going to have to find an electronic solution with pre-clearance, with the AEO trusted trading system in place, and we will finish up with a border which does not have a physical presence there, which does, there may be some leakage. Smuggling has gone on for years and years in Ireland. I'm sure it'll continue. But you could have a trusted trader scheme for major companies. You could have exemptions for smaller ones. You might have to put up with a little bit of, here's your father around the edge, but that would be a small price, very small price to pay for getting ourselves out of all the obligations that we're faced with at the moment on the Irish backstop. The third thing is that we would then be able to negotiate trade treaties with third countries. If we're stuck in half into the single market and half into the customs union, we really wouldn't be able to do that. If we have the sort of deal, no deal that we're talking about here, outside the customs union, outside the single market, then we certainly should. I've got some reservations myself about just how valuable these free trade treaties would be, but they're certainly worth something, and they'd be put into the pot on the right side of the negotiations. The final issue is around what might then emerge in terms of negotiations. And here's the situation. We have a balance of payments deficit with the European Union of about £100 billion a year. It is a massive, massive sum. And if we throw away all the cards that we ought to have in our hands on the Irish border and on the 39 billion, our ability to get a decent deal negotiated, a trade deal, is going to be very heavily circumscribed. But if we hold our nerves and have those negotiating cards in our hands, and really the fact that we pay large sums of money into the European every year, and we've got a huge balance of payments deficit, ought to have given us enormous leverage in these negotiations. If we can hold our nerve and use them, then I think our prospects are very much better. Now, my view about the European Union, I've been campaigning on this issue for years and years and years. I've never thought the European Union had nothing to be said for it, but I thought on balance that our involvement with it wasn't worth it, that we paid too much in, that we were caught in the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy, we were constrained on our laws, and with all these various issues that we're concerned about, that we're better off outside. And that's the view which I've kept the right way through, and I haven't changed. But to do this, we do need to be outside the single market and the customs union, and we need to be able to negotiate Canada-type free trade deal. And my message to you really today is that we are in a very difficult situation as a country. With the vote that we had in 2016, we really can't go back on the democratic decision that was taken then. The withdrawal agreement is really an appalling agreement. To be honest with you, in my opinion, worse than staying in. But if there's still light at the end of the tunnel, if we can hold our nerve, finish up with a no-deal outcome, and then negotiate a deal with Canada, deal along the Canadian lines, with a free trade deal outside the single market, outside the customs union, but cooperating as much as we possibly can on all the issues where we've got common interests with the European neighbours we have. That is the outcome, which actually would not only be one which fulfilled the terms of the referendum in 2016, but it would provide a stable basis for the UK to have a good relationship with the European Union running to get ahead. I think one of the real snags about the withdrawal agreement, as Owen Paterson said, is it just precipitates us into another 2 years or maybe even 4 years of endless, bitter negotiations where we've got the wrong end of the stick all the time and finishing up worse and worse off. That's what we need to avoid. What we need to do is be prepared to go through a roughish time for the next few months to come out at the end of the day with what we all really want.